Hi, this is Chuck with Nerd 3D Graphics. Today I'm going to show you the splash tool. I've got one loaded here on the screen, and let me show you the parts of the splash tool and what they do first. You can see you have a little cone-shaped outline. This is the control handle of the tool, and it has all of the dials used to set up a splash simulation contained in it. The little thing that looks like a flower laying on the ground is a set of splash emitters. This is where all the drops of simulated splash will be emitted from. If I move the camera so we can see below the floor, there's also some little diamond shapes in the bottom of each of the emitters. These are links in a chain that hold the emitters together. This allows you to position the emitters individually if you ever need to do something like that. You can translate them side to side and rotate them independent of each other if you need that kind of detailed control. Let me show you what some of the controls in the handle do. We'll start with the easy pose controls. Now you may wonder what a splash tool is doing with easy pose controls. These control the little chain that the emitters are hooked onto. The reason we have a series of emitters rather than just one, this allows you to create different shaped splashes. Now the most common splash is just going to be a circular splash, and that's why the easy pose default setting is for a little circle of emitters. You're probably going to use this most. But if you straighten it out, you can create something like a boat wake, a water ski wake. You could actually create something dragging through the water by setting them off in sequence. And as with anything that's easy pose, you can bend it all sorts of different ways. I don't think I need to explain this one to you because you've probably all seen easy pose before. The next dial is the one that actually makes the splash happen. As you spin the dial, a set of droplets are added to the scene, translated up, rotated back down, and then removed from the scene. This all happens in one spin of the dial. The splash will start from almost zero. It should peak, at least the first elements of the splash will peak at around 0.5, and the first elements of the splash will hit the floor at around 1. The total duration of the splash is going to depend on how you've got all the rest of the dials set up. Okay, let's go on to the splash setup dials. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to zero out all of these dials so I can show you what they do without the influence of any of the other dials being set. First, I'm going to set the splash so it's at about 0.5. That'll give you a good reference point to look at. Get everybody zeroed out here. All the randoms and everything are all set to 0 so that we have a nice clean slate to start from. Okay, you notice the splash kind of went away when I zeroed off this first dial here. That's the splash density. What the splash density means is how many of the splash elements are going to be used in the splash. This is how long the splash lasts, from the time the first drop leaves the emitters to the last drop leaving the emitters. Normally, you're going to have this set at about 0.25. That's the default value. If you have a large object that's creating the splash, you're going to have a little bit longer splash. If it's small, it's going to be shorter. For small splashes, you'll probably also want to turn down the splash density. Now I know this kind of just looks like a little cactus or something sitting here, and that's because we've got all the things that make it look like a splash kind of turned off right now. The splash height and range are the approximate distance the little drop groups are going to travel in. It's probably closest to being feet. These total height and total width of the splash is going to be affected by other randomization settings that are down below here. The splash depth control allows us to control how far the droplets travel. With the dial set to 0, the droplets would be removed from the scene before they even really get a chance to travel out of the emitter. As we set the drop higher, the drop completes its flight and returns to the floor with this set to about 1. Now we can set this so that the drops travel further than where they came from. And the reason you would want this is if you need the water to splash out of a container like a sink or a bathtub or something like that. With a setting of 1.5, the drops will actually travel about the same distance they originally flew below the splash. And the more you increase this, the further they travel below the floor before they're removed from the scene. The default value of this is 1. That has the splashes returning to the same level that they started from. The splash scale X, Y, and Z is just a simple scale function to make the splash bigger and smaller. You've seen that before. The emitter spacing changes the distance between each of these little emitter groups. It's approximately feet in poser units. The sequence delay, these two kind of work together, the emitter spacing and sequence delay. The sequence delay makes the first emitter and last emitter, or actually each emitter, start firing and of course finish at a different time. So you can create progressive effects using a delay in the sequence. This is especially useful if you have your emitters in a straight line for creating those water ski, boat wake type effects. That brings us to the splash details. The splash details are going to be part of what makes the splash become random looking, making it look like a real splash and not a cactusy looking bush thing. The drop collimate, and you might wonder why we would ever use this one. It takes all of the drops and puts them in a straight line. This can be used to create stringy looking splash effects. And just quickly, I'm going to go down and use a dial that I haven't explained yet so you see why you might do that. If we start with a stringy effect and have it expand like this, it kind of looks like a sticky mud splash instead of just fluid water. That's one place you might use the collimate. Drop spread simply expands the drops outward from the center of the emitter. You'll always have a little bit of this dialed in. Align X and align Z. Align X causes the drops to form a straight line parallel to the axis of the emitters. Align Z forms a straight line perpendicular to the axis of the emitters. Why ever would we use these? Well, the Align X is great for those water ski boat wake effects because it spreads the splash along a straight line that would be the wake of the boat. And when you add randomization to this straight line of emitters, it makes a great boat wake effect. If we do the same thing with the Z alignment, this would be an effect that you could use to create mud being slung off of tank tracks or monster truck tires or something like that. The effect is straight lined across the axis of the emitters. Okay, drop length. Drop length is plain and simple how long the little droplet drops are. And you might wonder why you'd want to make these little droplets look longer or shorter even. If you stretch them out, I'm going to turn the density down here so you can see the individual drops a little bit better. Okay, just tweak this a little bit so you can see the drops individually a little better here. The drop length, as you can see, it spreads out the length of these little groups of droplets that have been shot out of the emitters. You can use this to create a fake motion blur effect. There are materials that are called drop blur that will enhance this fake motion blur effect that saves you from actually having to use the real motion blur effects in your render engine. Drop diameter is simply what it says it is. It's the diameter of the drops. Drop size makes the drops uniformly larger. You can also make them uniformly smaller and blink them right out of existence. Drop tier changes the shape of the drop into a teardrop shape. And here I'm going to use a dial I haven't explained yet to get these drops spread out so we can see just one drop. You can see that with the teardrop dialed in, the drop takes on the shape of a teardrop or a raindrop. The drop skew is going to be used when you've got a little bit of length in the drops. The skew causes the tail of the drop to move towards the center of the effect. This makes the drops look like they're tracking along the actual splash line. These are the drop skew, the drop tier, and length can be used together to create the fake motion blur effects. You zero these out. The last one in the splash details is drop distort, and it simply makes the drops all different shapes, which is probably more like a real splash than the fake motion blur. Now we come to the randomization. There's two kinds of randomization in the splash tool. This first group is randomizations that affect the drops all the way through their flight, from being launched out of the emitter to hitting the ground. The effect stays the same. All the drops size randomly when you dial random size. That random effect stays the same through the whole flight of the drop. Random ZX simply moves each drop in a random direction on the same plane that it was in originally. The random Y is the one I kind of cheated and used a minute ago, and all it does is take the drops when they're emitted in little clusters here and spreads them out vertically along their flight path. Random rotate. You see the little groups of drops? As I spin the random rotate dial, you can see that each one of these little groups of drops is rotating at a different speed. And what this does is it produces an effect that the drops are following different paths and taking different heights, and it makes the effect look very, very random. You'll use the random rotate a lot. Random spread just causes each group of drops to spread out a random amount. This one's going to get used a lot too. Random height and random range. These are going to affect your, way back up here, your splash height and splash range. They're going to interact with each other. The random height takes the height that you set the splash for and simply multiplies it by a random number. Some drops will go higher, some drops will go lower. The same is applied to the random range. Some drops will go higher, some drops will go lower. Some drops will go the other direction, as this one and this one have gone completely different directions. That brings us down to the dynamic settings. Gain size. The further the drop flies from the emitter, the bigger it gets. I'm going to go ahead and dial the splash operate up a little bit more so you can see this a little bit better. Okay. You can see the drops over here are much bigger than the ones over here. That's what the gain size does. And that's kind of the way all of these controls in the dynamic group work. Their effect increases or decreases as the drops move along their flight. The gain in random Y, as you can see, The drops that are just coming out of the emitter haven't been affected at all, but these drops over here have been affected a lot. Same for gain and ZX. The drops just coming out of the emitter, barely affected. These over here that are nearing the end of the flight have been affected a lot. You'll use gain spread a lot. This is what really makes it look like a splash. The further the drops get away from the emitter, the more they spread out. Gain align X and gain align Z. These are actually here to remove this effect that we talked about earlier. The drop align X and drop align Z. As the splash develops and gets further away from the boat wake or water ski or whatever's making the long skinny splash, the splash becomes less long and skinny and more just a random mess of water. You can dial out the gain Z effects by putting a negative number in these. And plus you can also do some weird things with your splashes if you want to. Okay, that's all the dials. And your head is probably swimming because we've covered a lot of ground, but it's not nearly as confusing as it sounds. Let's take a simple, basic splash just loaded and make it look like a splash. Okay, here we have a splash tool as it loads out of the library. I'm going to set this to 0.5. And you'll see that the splash doesn't really have much charm to it. It just kind of looks like a bush there. What we need to do is make it more random. And I'm going to skip way down here all the way to the randomization dials. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some random height and some random range. That's probably too much. This is a small splash, so we don't have much. Just changing those two things, you can see it went from being this boring little thing that looked kind of like a bush to it actually, just with 0.1 on these two dials, it's starting to look really like a splash with just a little change. Now, it comes out of the box and loads with gain spread already in it. But we're going to add a little bit more to this, just in that we're still using the simple randomization. We're going to add a little random rotation, and what this does, remember, this makes it so each little group of drops spins a different direction. We're also going to add some random Y. This moves the drops different distances along their little flight paths. Okay, and just to make it nice, we're going to put a little drop distortion, and we're going to add teardrop to it. Okay. Now it looks a little confused, and that's because for a small splash, it's probably actually got a little too much density in it. There's too many drops being involved in here. Let's turn the density down. It looks like 0.5 is going to work well. Now, if we spin the dial, it looks more like a splash. A splash this small would probably have a little bit less duration than that. So I'm going to turn the duration down to 0.1. There we go. That looks like a splash. Now, of course, you can use this tool just to create still images, but you know how I love to animate. And this is really easy. I'm just going to start at frame 0 here, and I'm going to scrub forward to about 40 frames, and I'm going to set this to 2. And it doesn't look like anything happened, because the whole splash has already gone by. That's kind of in slow motion because I've told it not to skip frames, but you see the idea. Once you've got the randomization set up for the splash, creating an animation with this is just as simple as it could possibly be. You set a 0 key at the beginning where you want your splash to start, scrub forward a little bit, around a second, set the splash operate dial so the splash has completely gone away, and that's all there is to animating with this. It's very, very simple. And there's another element to the splash tool that I haven't shown you yet, and I need to do that. The splash tool has another part called the splats. Okay, this is a scene that I've already animated, and it contains the splash tool, and it also contains a splat tool. And the splat tool, you can't really see it right now because all of the splats are invisible, which is actually the way it's supposed to work. Let me grab its control handle, and that's this little diamond-shaped thing here. And just quickly, I'm going to turn all of the splats on just a little bit so you can see them. There they are, scattered all over the floor. Its tool settings are very simple. We have a simple length and width dial that controls the size of the effect. Twist all simply rotates all of the splash effects the same way, side to side. This tilts all of the splat dots left and right. You would use this if the splash was coming from a particular direction. Bend does the same thing except it's forward and backward. Scale all very simply scales all the little splash droplets. Scale X scales them in one direction, so does Scale Z. You'll probably never use those, but I'd put them in there just in case you needed them. Randomize X, Y, and Z. This moves the droplets in a random fashion side to side, up and down. You'll probably never use the up and down, but it's there, and the Z. Randomized twist makes each of the little droplets twist in a little bit different direction. This makes them look like they're not the same. Randomized side to side can be used to simulate splashes that are coming from all different directions. Same with front to back. Size Z and X randomization, just the same thing as these up here. It just makes them different sizes side to side. You will probably use the randomized side to side, randomized size, because it makes each splash a different size. A little bit of that goes a long ways. The splats are actually grouped into 10 groups, so they can be fired all at once with the all splat dial, or they can be fired in small groups. This makes it look like a progressive series of splashes happening over a period of time. The way a splat is made is you start with the 0, set a keyframe, move a couple frames forward, move the splat up, move a couple more frames forward, make the splat bigger, move a couple more frames forward, and then 0 on both. If that sounds like a lot of no fun, you're absolutely right. And that's why we've included in the splash tool a set of animated splats in a 60 or a 30 frame cycle. So you don't have to go through that tedious operation of setting up the splats. Just use the pre-animated cycle and it'll save you a lot of clicking around. Okay, so now we have a splash and a splat. Let's see what they do when we put them together. I'm going to scrub this forward in the timeline so it goes a little faster than just letting it go one frame at a time. You can see the splash lofts up in the air, and as the drops begin returning to the ground, I've timed this so the splat tool goes off. And there you go. All the splats happen after the splash lands. I'm going to bring in the animation palette here so you can see how this was set up. Here's the splash tool. This is the duration of the splash right here. This is the duration. You can see when the splash starts hitting the ground here at frame 40, that's when the splats start happening. And this little group of little green and gray squares with the slashes on them, that's the pre-animated section of the splat tool going off. And everything's over by frame 70, which would actually be a really long time for a splash, almost 3 seconds, but it's good for a slow motion splash. And we have this rendered out at the end. I'm going to show you how this looks all rendered at the end of the video. There you have it, the splat tool, the splash tool, and you'll find also in the runtime that you have a couple of other interesting little doodads. In the pose folder, you have a special Python script that says reseed. This is a poser only tool. The reseed changes the randomization of the splash. It makes it so that two splash tools with exactly the same settings will produce a slightly different result. This can save you time if you've got to make a really big splash and you need to overlap some of the tools together. Just reseed the second tool and you'll get a different look out of the same settings. It changes all the random values inside the splash. These basic tools up here, turn smoothing on and off. For the splash, you can turn shadows on and off for the splash and for the splats. The animation, the sample animation, the dive-in animation, is the splash animation used from one of the promotional videos that you'll probably have already seen, as is the ripple animation that's used to create that promotional video. I have also two sample animations used for the splash tool. We have the water ski splash and the splat cycle. Let's have a look at that animated sequence we rendered out earlier.